Well, welcome to the next part of our morning session. We are going to be talking about bills that were passed in this legislative session that relate to housing and land use. Um, it's interesting, and well, we'll talk about that as we get into it. First of all, our panelists are up here. Two of them you already know; they were just on the previous session, Carson and Steve. But there's a guy in the middle that we don't know. Well, some of us don't know. I have to tell this story about Sean before I let him introduce himself and we love to tell this story, both of us, for different reasons. I went early in my career. I volunteered. I was asked to teach an introduction to planning class at the University of Utah, and so I was trying to get students all familiar with planning and what it was. And guess who one of my students was in that class? Mr. Sean Guzman. So we've been familiar friends ever since. So
Ever since, and he told me
take the mic there, Sean, and introduce yourself.
is on.
You need to, at the bottom, push at the bottom.
Each one's different. I just want to clarify this. As a lowly undergraduate, Wilf said, if you want to make $1 million, be a planner. And then I got my degree in planning and went out and looked for a job and decided to go to law school.
Yeah.
So, because I found out to be a planner and make $1 million, you have to work 1 million hours.
Yeah. Well, I would agree.
What's that?
I don't remember what I get.
That's right. Did you give me an
I
idea?
don't know. I don't remember.
You know what? I'm going to go back and check.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you didn't, you're in trouble. That's a good one, Jim.
Yeah, we.
I would have given you an A.
All right, let's talk about the legislative session. Oh, Sean, just quickly introduce yourself. The other two have already done so.
Okay. My name is Sean Guzman. I'm the Government Affairs Director for the City of St. George. I've done that for the last approximately 4 years. Before that, I was about 19 years as City Attorney for St. George, and I have an undergraduate in planning
That's right.
from the University of Utah. And I will be retiring on June 15th. So what is that like to have one of your students retiring? I just want to ask you, what does that mean?
That's what people ask me when they say, you have a grandson that's already how old? Yeah, it's the same type of deal.
Consider me one of your grandsons then.
Yeah, that's okay. All right. Well, it was an interesting session. I guess I would introduce it to say, well, let's advance on the slides here. Here are some of the major themes from this year. I'll just introduce it with that, and then we'll get into some of the bill specifics. But there really weren't any what I would call big earth-shattering bills this year. Now, you can dispute that maybe a little bit because a couple of our panelists already talked about a couple of the bills that were passed that really are pretty impactful. But I think planners and others in the land use arena kind of look at those as being finance-related bills, and they don't really equate them to being land use-related bills, but they actually do relate directly to land use because they may make future development more possible and more feasible. So those were probably a couple of the biggest bills, and we'll talk about those. This was an interesting. Are y'all familiar with the Land Use Task Force? You know what that is? That was something that was established in about 2006 after there had been some gigantic battles between the development community and cities and towns and planners on the other side. And I mean, we called it the nuclear war. And the president of the Senate at the time also happened to be the president of the National Association of Realtors. And he basically proposed a bill because as a result of all of this going on, that basically would have done away with land use planning provisions in local government or very severely restricted them. Everybody knew that probably wasn't going to happen, but I mean, it was a huge battle. What it really pointed out was every year at the legislature, you had the development community come up, and you had the local governments there that, of course, oversee development in the communities, and they were always fighting things out right there at the legislative session. And after that big battle, the discussion was that the comment was, there's got to be a better way to deal with this than to come up here at the legislature in a 45-day session and have it out and duke it out. And so what happened was that a land use task force was created, which took people from the development side and the real estate side, people from the local government side, and also state officials, state people involved. And they would meet between legislative sessions to talk about issues that were arising. And it wound up working so well that what they would work out together was whether there was even a legislation needed, and if it was, that they could come to an agreement on what that legislation ought to say. And for a period of time, it worked so well that legislative leadership, anytime that a legislator proposed a land use bill, legislative leadership would say to that legislator, have you been to the land use task force yet to have them look at this? And no land use bill got through the legislature without it first being discussed and reviewed by the land use task force. That's no longer the case. For the last couple of years, it's not been happening that way. We still have the land use task force, and they discuss issues, and they generally come up with a bill, and we'll talk about the bill this session that was the result of that. But we are seeing a lot more bills that are coming forward now in the legislative session that have not been reviewed or even seen, or that the land use task force was even aware that they were coming, which means we're kind of starting to get back into these fights in the legislative session. So that's not a positive thing. What I found was interesting was that there was a resolution in the legislature this year that would have recognized and thanked the land use task force. It didn't pass. I don't know that it ever came up for a vote. I don't know that it ever got that far.
I think we killed that one really.
Yeah. So I don't know what that says about the land use task force. Another thing that was really interesting about this legislative session, one of the things that I talk about, I said was, I am the legislative representative for the American Planning Association, the Utah chapter. Actually, I have been since 1990. Francis Lilly, who's here today from Mill Creek City, he was recently elected to the board, and he'll be taking over. He is taking over that function, and I'm working with him, hoping to get him up to speed. He's doing a good job to get up to that. But I was tracking this session, 43 bills. That's a lot of bills. That is more bills than I've ever had to track on land use issues. Less than half of them, or about half of them, passed. But that's a deceptive number, because what we found was happening was that some bills that didn't seem to be moving fast enough, or for other reasons, were actually getting grafted into other bills. And so we had some bills that had 2 or 3 other bills put into them, and then they were passed together as a new bill. So really more than half of the bills that I was tracking passed, just in a different form. I hadn't really seen much of that in the past. I saw it occasionally, but it really seemed to be happening a lot this session. When you say, gentlemen, it was really something remarkable to see that happening. Go ahead, Carson.
I was just going to add, overall, there were about 1,016 bills introduced, which is more bills by a significant margin than any time in legislative history. But they actually ended up passing about 50 fewer bills than the prior 2 years. So there was really this significant logjam, and a lot of bills were kind of reorganized and recompiled, but it made for an interesting dynamic where if a bill was moving, if it was on one of the final reading calendars, then it became very interesting for everybody who had a topic that was in another bill to try to add to that right before it passed.
And we had over 600 House bills, right? Think so? Because someone called me and said, what do you think of House Bill 6 something? And that can't be right. I don't even know what that is. And then looked it up, and I'd never seen a House bill with a 6.
600.
600. It was crazy. So trying to follow all these bills was really impossible. One thing I will say is I think that leadership did a good job of slow walking some of these bills, because it was too hard to really comprehend everything that was going on. And like you said, when they started folding them into other bills, we started losing track of what the bill number was. So It was very difficult.
Yeah, I agree. Another thing, and this is probably more impactful for planners and local government folks, but there were a number of provisions regarding land use in bills passed this session, and they're not in LUDMA, what we call LUDMA, which is the Land Use Development and Management Act. You'll see some of these as we go through them, but they're not in the LUDMA. When somebody is dealing with, am I current with state code with regarding land use issues, they go to the LUDMA section of the state code, and that's what they follow. And by the way, another commentary on that section is getting huge. I made a kind of a joke last year saying, like in the rabbinical schools, you have the rabbis that are very, focused on it, and they spend time studying it, and they tell everybody what the law is. We're getting to that point with the LUDMA, that we got to have rabbis that are going to be studying it and having to tell the rest of us what's in there and what we need to be doing. Brent? Tell me why they decided to renumber. Yeah, what Brent was referring to by renumbering LUDMA is that it was recodified in a special session last year, and it's got a new section, and then there's another provision now called Land Use Provisions for Housing, I think is what it's called. And I think LUDMA was getting so big and unwieldy, I think the sentiment was just that it needed to be reorganized, and I think that's what they did. And by and large, I think it's not bad, but a lot of us didn't know it was happening. You're not saying what your it sure was not.
So it was actually following, so they were recodifying the county code. They wanted to do it during the special session because they wanted to be able to fix any issues that arose or any policy questions that arose during the general session. So it happened in September or October. And we got a call like a couple weeks before that special session telling us, we want to recodify LUDMA while we're at it because they were reorganizing all the county section of LUDMA. So then we spent a couple weeks frantically trying to compare the new 1020 versus 109A. So it was not our desire to do so, but they wanted to have consistency between county and city, and that's why they did it.
Well, yeah, I guess you could kind of say that it is the county's fault. It was a side effect, but yeah. Question here.
Thank you. For those of us who might be newer, the Land Use Task Force, if it was so successful and worked so well, what happened to break it, and can it be reconstructed?
Go for it, question.
I think the Land Use Task Force is still successful.
It is.
And the resolution didn't move forward because it became a citation instead of a resolution, so it just became a recognition. There was not a lot of extra time for resolutions that didn't have a lot of actual impact. So I think it still works. I think the reason you saw just a lot more bills, period. And some of them were run by new legislators. Some of the issues the legislator just didn't either know about the Land Use Task Force, just didn't think it was necessarily a technical land use item. The Land Use Task Force has in recent years been a little more focused on some of these really complex issues that are maybe not as glamorous a policy, and maybe just more focused on something that really only land use practitioners care about. But some of it was also bandwidth. Like we had, I don't even know how many issues at the start of the Land Use Task Force this year, but much more than we had time to actually tackle. So it was really just logistical things. I think the Land Use Task Force is still successful. We just have to, we're always faced with the challenge of trying to scale it with limited people and limited time.
I think the Land Use Task Force is more valuable because people are poking their finger in different areas that they don't have a very good understanding of. And there was a big freshman class of legislators that got very wound up, as we talked about in the last session, about PIDs and with some false information about what they are and what they do. And so the Land Use Task Force, I think, becomes even more critical to help to provide a level of expertise that the legislature can look to, that the body of the legislature can look to and say, how does the Land Use Task Force feel about it? So I think it actually increases in value. It's herding chickens, herding cats. I mean, just trying to keep legislators. It'd be like, there were, how many education bills every year? 300 education bills. We talk about creating a structure around that. And because every legislator can kind of do what they want, there's market failures there.
Okay. Let me, I'll come right back. On my way, let me just say about the Land Use Task Force, it is not a formal body. It does not exist in code or law or anything like that. It's an informal body, which means, it was just kind of an idea that somebody said, let's try this. And people kind of informally set it up. And the league is actually primarily running it at this point, but it seems to work pretty darn well. And I think it's even gotten, Carson, maybe you can address this, but I think Cameron and you guys are being asked about that in other states, saying, boy, that's really a good idea to have the development community and the local government side talk to each other. It doesn't seem to happen in our state much.
Yeah. I think it is sort of an anomaly compared to other states where we talk with our counterparts and they might meet with their home builders association maybe once a year. And I think it's a really valuable communication channel, and it's consensus based. So we don't always get to yes, we don't always see eye to eye on everything. And in fact, I think in recent years we might have more things that we see not eye to eye on. But I think it's important that we talk to each other and try to understand where both sides are coming from.
So if I could maybe just give maybe a legislative perspective, and this is my own personal perspective. I'm Ray Ward. I serve from Bountiful. The Land Use Task Force serves a really, really important role, but saying it's consensus based is true. There is another way to describe that. And we would say the Land Use Task Force, the League of Cities and Towns has a complete veto over anything they don't like because it's consensus based. So for things where there can be a consensus, it really serves an important role. But if there are policies that a legislator wishes to run where they say, look, I know the league doesn't like this. I understand that they hate it, but I still think it's important, then the Land Use Task Force, you're going to say, well, probably not going to go through there because there's just a veto from the League of Cities and Towns. And I do think it is important to remember that at different levels of government, there are really different interests that you would think it's all the same constituents, but the way that you sort those constituents matters a lot. In Bountiful, when I survey my constituents, even though they all live in Bountiful, and I ask the question, do you think that we should allow for more smaller homes to be built, even when the zoning right now says they shouldn't, but should we find a way to let that happen? When I put that survey out, my constituents tell me yes. I believe my city council members and my mayor when they say, well, when we put that survey out, they say no to it. And just the kinds of things that elect city councils to office, the forces that people come in and shake their fist if you let something be built that they didn't want to be built. The same group of constituents, somehow when they come to someone on a state level, they say, please find a way to let more smaller housing be built. So, I mean, our interests we still need to work together, but I think there is also an important discussion that happens outside the consensus process.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point, Representative. And I think the purpose of the Land Use Task Force has never been to say that like there shouldn't be these other conversations. It's just say here's the things that we vetted. And you're right, there's some issues that like I don't think that our members will ever support. And there's the legislative session for that, right?
For those of you online who may not have known who that was Representative Ray Ward from the Bountiful area, and who has run some bills and has not had a lot of traction with his bills. But he raises a very good point about issues that may not be consensus found. And so there is a valid point that there needs to be some way to consider those things because they may be raising valid issues. I find it interesting with Representative Ward, the point that he raises about, constituents saying, yeah, it's a good idea to have smaller lots. And yet when you go to the city council, they're like, no, we're not going to allow for that. I have some research-based stuff that I have a blog that I do on the Utah Land Use Institute website. And I actually have this research that showed that when a survey question, and this was actually researched and done around the country, when a survey question says, is it a good idea to allow for more housing to be built and smaller housing, more affordable housing, and so on? When you ask that question community-wide, it usually comes out very positive. Yes, we think that should happen. Then when you ask the question in a specific neighborhood, should that be allowed in this specific neighborhood? It's generally, well, no, not in this neighborhood, someplace else. So, and the city councils react to that.
Well, I won't get too deep in this because we get to hear from Ray later today, but Representative Ward, ADUs have happened because of Ray Ward. leading that discussion and creating discomfort among the consensus. And we're going to have a very, very interesting discussion on by right single family lot statewide because of a bill Representative Ward ran this last session that got people thinking about, like, wow, are we really, we can't do that? And so there's a tremendous amount of value in individual legislators saying, hey, this is the right policy, and it's tough. And
to it. This bill pulls all of that together, pulls all of the functions related to housing together.
makes sense.
Hang on, we have a question.